interim. But my name is Loretta Kaler, and I'm a president of Inter-Neighborhood Cooperation. So welcome today. I wanted just to take a minute and just to have a moment of silence for 9/11, since this is the 20th anniversary of 9/11. So I wanted just to take a moment of silence just for all of us to remember the victims of 9/11. All right, thanks everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning. I mean, it's a somber memory, 9/11, but we're all here today, and I want to go forward. And today we have a meeting dealing with, we're going to go over good neighbor agreements, and I think that's an important thing for RNOs and neighborhoods, and we'll talk from differing perspectives. And I want folks in the delegation to join in and give your perspective. If your neighborhood has a different perspective than the folks we have join us, we have some folks who have some interesting, unique experiences and who've done quite a few GNAs. So we'll get to that in a few minutes. The other thing, I just want to start off with committee reports. Now, I want everybody to remember we're still here via Zoom, and we're still meeting via Zoom. If you joined us earlier during the meet and greet time between 8:30 and 9, you heard us talking about COVID and some of those breakthrough cases, and hopefully we're all staying safe and healthy, and and getting vaccinated if you can. But we hope to meet in person again sometime in the future. But for now, this is the safest way, and this is our way to make sure that we can have people join us. So we're still meeting via Zoom. The other thing that's helpful to note is that everyone has that opportunity to go back and look at our previous meetings that are on the INC website, and you can also look at committee meetings. So it's really important to go back if you missed one, and you have that opportunity to join us and watch those and review those meetings on Zoom. So please go to the INC website to look for those. Why don't we go ahead and start just updates, when the next meeting is, if you've had a meeting, what are upcoming topics, what are topics to look for in the city, and give us just a brief update. Committee chairs, I don't know if we have everyone because I'm sharing my screen, but let me go ahead and stop sharing, and let's go ahead and get, there we go, Christine just joined. So if we have, Maggie, do you want to go ahead and just give us a brief update on parks?
We haven't been meeting regularly. I hope after the fall months, we'll start that up again.
Okay, great. Is there any topics in the city that people should look for?
Oh, there's so many things going on, Fairfax Park, which we looked at some time ago, has been really in the news as far as some of the means that it became a park and the players that are working within it. That's one. Of course, we know we have two ballot measures concerning Park Hill Golf Course. One, number 301, which was applied for by Yes on Open Space. And then the other one that is to contradict that particular ballot initiative is initiated by West Side. We hope to have them at our next meeting to discuss, to at least introduce their thoughts. I don't believe that we'll take a position we already have.
Great. Thanks, Maggie. Greg, I just want to chime in because I saw in the chat too. Our PayPal account has been compromised. And so if you want to make a donation, or if you're updating your membership, and if you haven't updated your membership or you're unsure if it's updated, please get back to us. Ask Troop D, raise your hand, Troop D. She's our membership chair, and so she can let you know if you're actually your neighborhood, your RNO is up to date or not. But please go to the chat and look at do membership donations to INC at our post office box for the moment. There was a question, Maggie, just in the chat about, does INC Parks work with Denver Parks Trust? And maybe you want to answer that in the chat.
Okay.
I don't know if you do or not.
Well, I'm online right now.
Okay.
We have had them come to some of our meetings, and those were recorded. We work with several park groups, so they would not be necessarily one that we partner with.
All right. Joel, are you on? Would you like to talk about transportation? I don't know if he's on yet. I don't know that I've seen him. Christine, would you like to talk about just give an update on zoning and planning?
Sure. Very quickly, we had a great discussion last month, no real presenter, and several ideas surfaced for the next few months. Right now, Ian is I think has already contacted Annalise Hawk in Community Planning and Development to invite her to give us a real update on the conclusions of the Affordable Housing Subcommittee he sits on. And remember, this is only for the market portion of looking at affordable housing. It's not the big umbrella affordable housing discussion. It's just for the market approach. And so we hope to have them on the agenda, but I don't have confirmation yet. I haven't heard. And I don't see Ian.
I'm here. I'm here. I'm happy to jump in. I want to make folks aware just of a couple opportunities to engage with this affordable housing work. There are community office hours, September 22nd. On the 30th of September, there'll be an implementation focus group that people can tune into. And then August 7th is our next advisory committee meeting. My understanding is they're in drafting now. They're working on some of that. And yeah, the 25th, we definitely want to have them come back. We did get some other interesting topics, suggested to us. Just as some notable, the growing movement by the GES Coalition to have a conversation about the triangle and what they'd like to see in the implementation of the plan in their own community. The NPI process is continuing. I think it's time for us to get an update on the NPI process. We have continued to be a squeaky wheel about community engagement and who's being contacted, language justice, those kinds of things. And so I always think it's good for us to check in on the NPI. But those are really the updates I have. I will say we're continuing to look for somebody who might be interested to joining our team, really to focus on excise and license.
Ian, can I ask you a question? You said there's September 22nd. Tell us more about that. That you said there's a.
They have open office hours. So, if you have questions about what's been going on, if we can go back in time just to give people an update really quickly. At first, it was really just going to be about height incentive zoning because we didn't have inclusionary housing as a tool. As we know, INC advanced a letter to the state about supporting inclusionary housing as a possibility for rental properties. It passed. And so now we're evaluating what it would really look like for all these tools, including inclusionary zoning requirements on rentals.
Ian, if you want to put anything in the chat that you think, or, where that open door, that time to comment or whatever question, if you could put that in the chat, that'd be helpful.
And I think we should probably send it out to the zoning list. So if you're not on the zoning list, please write to Ian and myself and give us your email so we can get you on the zoning list. And Ian, you said August 7th, you mean October 7th, correct?
Oops. Yes, you caught me.
Okay.
October.
Thank
All
you.
right. Great. Thank you very much. Do we have Joel on yet? Joel, are you here? And I looking through my list and I don't see him. I don't know if anyone attended Thursday night's transportation meeting, but it was very informative. Part of that was also a discussion about, let me go back and look at my notes, the GO bond, and there's a whole list of things that were on that. It was a jam-packed meeting. So and I've heard that it's been added to the INC website. So please go there and watch that, because there was a big discussion about sidewalks in Denver. And Councilman Cashman was on, that's a big thing for him. So it was a very interesting and informative meeting. So if you had the chance to be on that Zoom, meeting, or if you'd like to watch it, please watch that on the website. So, okay.
Loretta, I would second that. I attended the meeting and it was wonderful. So I would encourage people to take the time to listen to the recording when that's available.
Yeah, there's so much information in that meeting. So it was jam-packed. And I don't know if we have Perry or Jane on today. I know they were both traveling a bit, but do we have Perry or Jane on to talk about climate and sustainability? If you haven't joined our climate and sustainability committee, they've been up and running. It's our new committee, but I don't see either one of them here today.
Hey, Loretta, I have an update that just relates to the climate work. For some of those who know, I, through the pandemic, was spearheading a Waste No More, an ordinance we're sending to the voters regarding how we handle our waste across many sectors. We received word last night that we are headed to the September 2022 ballot. We turned in over 17,000 signatures, and I'm just happy to share that with the community, and that's something related to the committee.
All right, great, thank you. Okay, let me go ahead and we'll go ahead and get to our next topic. We're kind of early because I think we didn't have everybody here, but we'll start. Let me tell you where we're at today. I think Trupti brought this up, and I put our agenda on the screen again, but part of the issue was a lot of neighborhoods work on good neighbor agreements, and I don't want to, I'm not going to speak much because I'm not an authority on them. I don't typically do them, but I know a lot of neighborhoods that are adjacent to businesses and, industry end up doing some, good neighbor agreements. And so we have pulled together some folks who've had some really great experience, and I'm really happy to say we have some great people, and I want the whole, all of, INC to chime in at times too, because I think we'll have our speakers talk a bit about their experience, and then we'll have, other members of this delegation today speak on the topics also, because I think we all bring differing perspectives, and some neighborhoods have more experience than other neighborhoods. We have the great pleasure of having Margie Valdez here today, who was formerly the chair of ZAP, and who's done a tremendous amount of work and a lot with Chun in the past. And so I think it's great. Now, just to let everyone know, we reached out to Excise and License, and we've had the benefit of having them present. And I looked back at, I had them present 2 years ago, in May 2 years ago, on on a topic, and we've had them present many times in the past. We didn't have them join us today. They didn't respond, and we would love to have, a perspective from excise and license. I just want everybody to know I've been reaching out to them for a couple of months and I've gotten no response. So I just want folks to know that we are going forward with our own panel. And I'm going to let you talk, Trupti. Go ahead.
Yeah, hi, thanks. So, interestingly, over in Northwest Denver, Sunnyside, who does not have a lot of GNAs that are active, and I started pulling the RNOs around us to kind of talk about how do you do it, what's your process, and I think maybe someone else, maybe it was Gertie or someone, or Margie, kind of, or Jeannie, who I think is on there, talking about this consistent experience, that businesses may face, and also kind of just being somewhat consistent in general. That was a conversation that had started in Northwest Denver, and we started sharing our templates and all that. And while I was doing that, there's this other issue that excise and license now redacts the name of the business owner, and at least Mary Giordano's experience and what she heard back and when she questioned was, we will no longer give you the name of the owner, and if they want to contact you, they know where to find you, kind of thing. Whereas we recently had a redacted
excuse me, Trupti, it's not
yes.
the name. They're not redacting the name.
The name of the owner and contact. Oh, contact.
Just the
information.
contact information.
Sorry about that. I thought it was both name and contact, but you're right. It's contact. So that was happening. But when we just recently had one with this redacted information, we reached out to excise and license, and they gave us a name and contact of the attorney. So maybe that's a new process, but we didn't get the same response that Mary Jane got. And at that point, I realized either there is some inconsistency with what excise and license is communicating. So all of this was happening, and we were looking for an agenda topic for this meeting. And we thought that this would be good. And with turnovers that we usually see, with RNOs and such, with board members, maybe it was a good time to kind of review. And that's why we wanted excise and license to start off the process of getting, a license and hearing and how an RNO can participate. But they just really, like to Loretta's point, have been non-responsive. And Loretta, if we do have time, and I think this would be valuable, is I did send out a survey. We only had 13 responses, but I'll share what the responses were in terms of the questions we were asking. One was, how many active GNAs do you have in your RNO? And of those 13, and all of this will be of the 13, 89 were between 1 and 5, and then it was greater than 11. So the rest were greater than 11. So we have a range there. Like I said, we only have 2 now currently. In terms of provisions, 90% of them, and remember, you could pick more than one because usually it's a bunch of provisions. 89% have noise on there. 44% also have trash on there. 67 have hours of operation. 33 limiting special event permits, and 22% exterior openings. That was a piece of it. Also asked about mediation. How many RNOs have gone through using the city's mediation process? Again, just trying to get some information on how people are using it. 11% had yes, they have, and a majority, 78%, were no. And then kind of the last important question was, what do you find these valuable as a tool? And 78% said yes, 22% said I don't know. And I think they're, again, back to the I don't knows. I think there are people who maybe, in the RNO as delegates and not really aware of a process. Again, why we thought maybe bringing this up would be, something to do every couple of years to make sure people are aware. And then as we're talking, I'll pull up any questions. There were a couple of questions that people put in, and I'll throw that out when we have some speakers and we can talk about their experience on that. So thank you very much, Loretta. And thank you folks for being here. We've got 40 people on. I'm excited that we had a good group interested in the GNA process. And for those who took the survey, thank you. And feel free, the survey is still open if you want to take that just for data collection and questions that we can later ask excise and license. Thanks, Loretta. Loretta, you're back.
Muted. Okay, sorry about that. Just so you know, thank you, Trupti. And just so you know, I did pull up our the INC website, and I shared that with you so that you could see that you can go to the site and you can look at sample good neighbor agreements. And so I think that's really helpful for neighborhoods. But I think the benefit of today is so that we can share and you can reach out to other RNOs to know, who else is doing one, what have you come up against. So I think that's part of the today's kind of presentation, is just so that we can kind of share in that. And then Steve just added in the chat that we have a collection of Baker Neighborhood Association, Historic Neighborhood Association has a collection of GNAs, and he put the link. So if you want to see ours, Baker is bracketed by Broadway and Santa Fe. So we have a lot of GNAs, but we work closely with West Wash Park. So we do have a couple of people to chat about that. But I want to start first with Margie Valdez. And I think most of you know Margie, and I'm happy to have Margie here today because she has a wealth of knowledge, and I know she's worked a lot with excise and license, and maybe you can tell us a little bit about what all you've done with excise and license in the past, Margie, because maybe people don't know about the academies and some other things you've done. So I think just a little background and then kind of go into it, Margie, would be great. Thank you so much. Oh, you're on mute too.
Okay, can everybody hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
You can hear me? Okay. Well, let me give you a little bit of background. And what I'm going to start out saying is no one has to agree with me. I am just going to offer some comments that I hope are helpful. About 15 years ago, how I got into good neighbor agreements, there was a shooting on Broadway, and I happened to live in the Boulevarde at the time, and the clubs, I was concerned about the safety for the residents that were living in that area. I contacted West Wash Park, the Golden Triangle, the Unthinkables, and then we had the Cultural Arts Organization, which included the museum residences. And we, for the most part, developed good neighbor agreements and worked together on several issues that had been arising in the neighborhoods. I've had several meetings and participated in working with excise and licenses on 3 citizens academies. They were extremely helpful. Their attorneys worked with us. The Citizens Academies consist of 30 people. They're held at nighttime, and we do them over a 6-week period. It's training people, giving them training RNOs and their delegates on how to draft good neighbor agreements, what you need to look for, the legal requirements, and the excise and licenses offered their attorneys to help, and they participated in the 3 citizens academies. Those that we put together take about 6 months to put together. And then you also have the academies themselves. We had an excellent relationship with excise and licenses. We had a citizens academy for marijuana. We went through the same process. Recently, Mary Jane Giordano from the Cultural Arts, she's now president of the Cultural Arts organization, and I have moved on to another area of the city. And she contacted me, and the notice form that the applicant completes and sending out for a new, it's either a new or it's a transfer or whatever. But anyway, it's one of the notices that the neighborhoods get. And the information had been redacted. And I thought, that's unusual. I mean, they've always had contact information. So I reached out to Excise and Licenses, and I have personally had a great relationship with them. They said they'd get back to me, and then I never heard from them again. And I kind of wondered, what on earth is going on? This is just not like Excise and Licenses. The director, Ashley Kilroy, she is a graduate of Duke University Law School. She is not a dummy. Why now, with no notice, to do this unilaterally? Why leave out the RNOs? It was a mystery. And I think it's a mystery that maybe we'll never resolve. But at least my thought at this time, well, maybe I need to back up a little bit. I did tell Mary Jane, I know the attorney that is representing the applicant. I gave her the telephone number for them, and I have worked with that attorney for over 10 years. Something is drastically wrong when they won't reach back to Mary Jane. I instructed her at the time to document her efforts and send it in to Excise and Licenses so it could be made part of the record for the hearing. So with no input, yesterday I received a recommended decision for a business license and a tobacco shop and fine wines in Denver. The attorney was Jim Benford. I have worked with Jim Benford for many, many years. This attorney is upright. He's cooperated. If no RNO even submitted a objection, they didn't even submit recommendations for the hearing. And what bothered me more than anything else is no one appeared at the hearing to oppose the application. The application was approved by the hearing officer. We need to at least submit written objections, and they don't have to be objections to the whatever it is they're applying for. What we need to object to is that nobody has reached out to the RNO to try to negotiate a good neighbor agreement. So it strikes me that I don't know what is going on, but I do know one thing, and I'm fairly certain, I feel very, very comfortable with saying this. This inability or the Excise and Licenses deleting the information is, in my opinion, there is probably a strong reason for them doing so. And like I said, nobody has to agree with me. They are not trying to get rid of INC. That I really do not believe they're doing that. I think something has happened. you know, I think with what we have in today's world, maybe there was a threat, maybe, I don't know. But my suggestion, at least at this point, is not to turn this into a lose-lose proposition. I think what we need to do is try to have a small group, Loretta and whomever, meet with excise and licenses and try to figure out how we can get from A to Z. Because if we continue down this road, it is not a good road for good neighbor agreements. It's not a good road for any kind of marijuana license. This is not helpful. We need to turn this into a win-win situation. And I don't think you should have 10 people going in to excise and licenses and trying to say, well, what are you trying to do? That is not where I'm coming from. I have worked with those people for so long that there's reasons. And so I think what we need to do is not be aggressive, but try to resolve the issue that has created this problem. When one stops and thinks about this, if you Google the applicant, their name and address is on there. It's on Facebook. I did that. And so what's the problem? And I think that's where we really need to dig in. Loretta, I would suggest that you have 2 or 3 people. You don't need to go in there with a lot. Try to set up a meeting with excise and licenses with Ashley and Erica. My goodness, those are not mean-spirited people. They're good people. This is something we need to get to the bottom of it. But what I would hate to see is 20 years of good neighbor agreements go down the tubes. We can't allow that to happen. It just strikes me. We need to resolve whatever it is so that we can turn this in to a win-win situation. The one thing, I mean, their own excise and licenses policy manual says the department encourages regular communication between neighborhood representatives and applicants' licensees for resolution of issues that are of concern to the community. Neighborhood representatives and applicant licenses have the option of negotiating a good agreement. So why would they do it? This is the whole purpose of their excise and licenses manual. And that's what we've gone by for years. The applicant must present at least one neighborhood witness from each neighborhood. I just would hate to see us at this point get in a battle with a department that we've had good relationships with in the past.
Thank you, Margie. And I think that language is really vital for all of us to understand. That language that, reaching out to the neighborhoods and making sure that, and giving them the opportunity to come present if they want to, or to respond. We had, and I appreciate a question from Christine. If you could give a mini version of how neighborhood groups should go about talking with potential applicants. And I think you have had a lot of, and I think hold on to that question for all the people who are going to speak. It's like, talk about how you reach out to and chat with potential applicants. Because I think, we do have a name, and I think some people will talk about how you can, go to the Secretary of State if they are in Colorado. If they're in another state, you're going to have to look at either that Secretary of State, or we all have Google, so we can Google, someone. But Margie, do you want to talk a little bit about how neighborhood groups should go about talking with potential applicants?
What we've done in the past is when we've called and said, for example, this is Margie Valdez. I represent the Cultural Arts Residential Organization. We notice that you have submitted documents, an application for, let's just say, a cabaret license, because those are tricky. And would you like to meet us at the applicant establishment? We always did that so we could go in, view the establishment, see where the dancing was going to take place, ask what the security requirements were going to be, and went through all of that with the applicant. And then thereafter, sometimes I would draft the good neighbor agreement. Sometimes the attorney would draft the neighbor agreement. And we would meet with the applicant and agree on the terms. We tried always to get restrictions on the face of the license. And I have to be careful here with what I'm saying, because we did some zig and zags at the beginning. When we initially developed this group that was working on good neighbor agreements, Tom Downey at that time was a director. And he stated that good neighbor agreements could follow to the next applicant. So if the business was sold, the new applicant would be bound by the good neighbor agreement. Well, we put that as tried to put it as a condition on the face of the license, and the hearing officers as well as the director said it's too broad, you can't do that. So the whole agreement cannot travel with the good neighbor agreement. But if you agree to restrictions on the face of the license, that can travel with the license, and it will go to if the applicant sells the business, that will continue on the face of the license. So I had to make that clarification when I was talking with someone yesterday. I thought, I recall that's how that occurred. If I remember correctly, we did 2 hearings for one in the Lincoln Broadway territory. We worked with Chun, we worked with the Golden Triangle Association, and we worked with the Unsinkables. And we prevailed on one. We did not prevail on the other. But nonetheless, there were only 2, if I recall correctly, 2 contested hearings. The rest of the time, we always had good neighbor agreements, and we had restrictions on the face of the license. That ensures that the applicant knows the terms that they agree to, and it helps the residents. I believe, in my personal opinion, that has helped the neighborhoods. And when you live in a neighborhood where you have cabaret licenses, I don't want to prejudice anything, but my goodness, it is interesting at 2:00 in the morning. I personally have witnessed vehicles going out of parking lots and hitting 4 or 5 cars. I mean, it really is quite a challenge. One of the owners of several cabaret and licenses there in the Broadway Lincoln area has actually reached out to the RNOs to let him know. Don't let them know. Don't call the police on us because they have to pay a fine if they call the police. Just reach out to me individually. And so that is why we always made an effort to meet with the applicant at the applicant's establishment so that we could actually have a face-to-face and establish a relationship so that we weren't always pitted against one another. It's very difficult to have a relationship where you're always fighting. I mean, you compare it to a marriage, what it ends up in is divorce. And I personally do not, I just don't believe that's a good way to go through life. And we did have a very good relationship. And that is why I really have strong feelings now that we need to reach out to excise and licenses, meet with them, just a small group, and say, did something occur that I don't think we're really going to get to share, but I believe we can reach a point where we will be able to figure out a way to get contact information. So, because it's sending a signal to the applicant right now that excise and licenses does not have the support of the RNOs. And that is a less signal we want to send. That's just my personal opinion. I started out saying no one has to agree with me. But that's where I'm coming from.
Well, thank you, Margie. And I think we'll come back to you with some more questions because I think, I think one thing to note just for everybody, Margie did mention the academies, and Maggie said that they are on our YouTube channel. So those would be great to watch. And there's been a lot of questions that I'd like the next presenters also to kind of dovetail on is the issues of, how do you get going? How do you contact the applicant? What is it like when you've had to go to a hearing? Have you had success? What's the follow-up? Because I know some of you have that experience. The other issue is, how do we, how do you keep that going? And I do like that you did bring up, Margie, the issue of that what follows, what continues on with the next license holder. So that's really valuable for people in RNOs to know that it's not just one entity, it can follow through to the next entity who has a license at that same location. So
Loretta,
yes.
could I just mention, I saw there were a couple of questions, and I should have included this when I was addressing the delegates. I did reach out to a member of City Council, and I did not get a response. And that is when it dawned on me that this was a very, very delicate issue. I have worked with that City Council member since that person was elected. We have an excellent, excellent relationship. When those people will not even acknowledge my telephone calls and my emails, something is wrong. And that is why I made the suggestion that I think at this point, it really behooves INC to have a very, very small group meet with, say, 3 of the council members and the director and Erica, and try to come up with a solution, because this is really not a good place for INC to be in.
Okay. I think, like I said, that we want to move forward, and I want to keep that thought in mind about getting a small group together and see what we can do to try and reach out to excise and license. I'd like to move on to Travis, and then I think we can direct questions to everyone too. But Travis, I think you're there. Do you want to go ahead and chime
Sure.
in about your experience?
Can you hear me?
Yes, can hear you great.
Okay, great, excellent. Well, I first need to acknowledge that I've learned everything that I know about good neighbor agreements from Margie Valdez, because she's the consummate good neighbor agreement writer, author, and teacher. So kudos to her. Yeah, I just wanted to add to the mix of the conversation that good neighbor agreements really are an opportunity for you to ideate and co-create some meaningful relationships with people or businesses or new development projects as they come into the community. And that's where we've had a lot of success in recent years from the Chun perspective, where we've available on our website, for example, you'll see our MOU with the now property owners for 123 Spear Boulevard, where we outlined a framework by which we were going to create and develop a neighborhood working group that would explore opportunities ranging from affordable housing to environmental sustainability to what kind of businesses we want at the sites with respect to the end work product. And the feedback that I'm receiving just from the designees on that working committee with respect to their negotiations with PMG is it's been an unprecedented working relationship, and things are moving forward in a very positive direction. And so to Margie's earlier points, this is not an opportunity, I think, to be adversarial, but rather to be collaborative. And so we feel good about that output. The other example that I would point to where we've had some positive discussions and collaborations. Oh, thank you. Yep, there's a handful of really great templates on our website. But I would point to the good neighbor agreements that we worked on for the safe outdoor sites that were piloted at 16th Ave and Grant, as well as, 14th Ave and Grant, and then 15th and Pearl. In that they were pretty exhaustive documents in terms of hours of operation, security protocols, and the like. And just this last week, I heard from a neighbor who said, thank you so much for putting together those good neighbor agreements for the 2 temporary safe outdoor sites, because that was the most stable the neighborhood felt in the context of addressing homelessness that's been present for the better part of a couple of years. And because they were pilots, they have now since left the neighborhood, but we use these as templates, or our peers use these as templates in the context of the Park Hill temporary safe outdoor site, and then also Regis. So again, it's an opportunity for you to sit down with the applicants, the property owner, neighbors, and create something really, I think, a nice set of guardrails by which one can operate. And then I would also point to the other good neighbor agreement that we put together for the Patterson Inn, where we worked with the owners to make sure that that is available for the community, and that there is some community connectivity. So the owners of the Patterson Inn have committed to hosting free events at least 4 times per year for community groups and nonprofits. So again, they're both a carrot and a stick in terms of our relationships with those coming into the neighborhood or already in the neighborhood, and use it to your leverage in some ways to bring new ideas, a fresh perspective, and some co-creation to the work, rather than approaching it, again, to Margie's point, with adversarial intent in mind, or that this is going to be a fight between a behemoth developer and a neighborhood group. And that's where we've found it to be the most effective.
All right, Travis, I just had a couple of questions that kind of follow-ups, and I'm sure we'll have people may want to ask some more questions later, but one question, you know, have you opposed anything, or have you gone in and seen, when you've gone to hearing, seen the license, you know, or anything altered, you know, based on what you tried to work with, you know, a business?
That's a really great question. Yes, but preceding my time on Chun, I'm sure that did occur, and my predecessors would be better suited to answer that question. But during my tenure, we have not had to contest anything or oppose anything in the context of the negotiations with the business owner, the license, the applicant, that I can recall. Everything's been a pretty positive working relationship. So one we worked on with respect to Las Delicias in Uptown, and we had some negotiations around whether the patio would be closed at 10 p.m. versus 11 p.m. Or the Park Tavern, another example, where it was a difference between 1 hour. Admittedly, Chun 2 was its own was party to a good neighbor agreement, where we're regulating. We worked with the neighborhood to regulate ourselves in the context of the redevelopment for the Tears McFarland House, and that was a pretty lengthy 3-year process with a robust 9-month negotiation with the neighbors as it relates to our rezoning for the tiers. And even that, we walked away with a positive output. I will also say too, Loretta, that we have worked with the city mediators and brought them in when we did feel like things were going to get a little bit heated or conflicted. So with respect to the Warren residences that are going to be at the former Warren Church at 14th and Gilpin, Steve Charbonneau was a monumental help in terms of convening neighbors and neighborhood groups to put together a good neighbor agreement. And even that, we walked away with positive outcomes.
All right, that's great. That's great to hear. There was one other question while I still have you on, and it was a question. Let me see if I can find it. Oh, about kind of enforceability. I mean, those issues, you know, and I know Gertie and Steve can talk about this, but the enforceability of things like, you know, if a business stays open longer, if they don't have a cabaret license, or if they're removing trash and recycling at 3 a.m. when they were supposed to remove it at 7 a.m. instead, or something like that. So can you talk a little bit about enforceability?
Yeah, I think in the case of, again, it really comes back to style in some cases, and willingness to just sit down with folks and have a conversation. And we haven't had to, again, in the context of my 4 or 5 years on Chun's board, had to weigh in a combative way around enforceability, because most of the problems that we needed to triage were addressed when we just elevated the concerns to the business owner. And so what I would encourage the group is, as you're putting together these good neighbor agreements with folks, is be realistic, give grace where grace needs to be given, because yes, sometimes maybe trash is going to be delayed because of traffic, or hours of operation might be a little later because of extenuating circumstances. So always look at it as an opportunity to engage and just course correct rather than wield a heavy hand.
Hey,
And then in
Loretta.
Can
I would also just add too, I think Margie could speak to more of the legal parameters around enforceability.
Okay.
Hey, Loretta, I
That's why you
recently,
put them on the face of the license, the restrictions on the face of the license. As a general rule, we tried to keep our restrictions to about 4 or 5 issues, and it was generally noise. Then when you negotiate that with the applicant, their licenses are posted when you walk in those doors. And when you go to the club, and if they see the restrictions on the face of the license, the people that enter know the applicant has those restrictions. Now, as a general rule, what we did is if we had 4 or 5 restrictions on the face of the license and the applicant had gotten kind of sloppy about certain things, we would reach out to the applicant and say, you said you promised you would do this. It's on the face of the license. And as a general rule, they would comply immediately. They would go back and do it. If they indeed do not, then you're going to have to request a hearing. I am going to advise everybody now, if you do request a hearing, it takes about 6 months, 8 months to put all the documents and the legal requirements for a contested hearing. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of paperwork. And by the same token, it costs the applicant a lot of money because they have to hire an attorney to represent the owner of the club. So my experience has been in Denver, there's very, very few contested hearings when you've got restrictions on the face of the license. And actually, one of them was for drugs that the bartenders were engaging in, and that went to a contested hearing. So that's why I'm saying, when you sit down with the applicant at the beginning and lay it out, these are the restrictions that are going to be on the face of the license. They, as a general rule, they will comply because they know they can have their license revoked. They can be suspended.
Right.
hey, Loretta, on this
Yes.
enforceability,
Do you need the thing?
Can someone mute who's not muted, please? Because we're hearing a kind of background
Kirsten.
noise. Yeah, okay. Shrupti, go ahead, and then Judy, and then I have a question too.
Sure. And this really goes to the enforceability question. And I wanted to share what Sunnyside United recently has dealt with our only GNA. And stepping back, this business, we almost had a 1.5 year contested process because he refused to sign a GNA, and it was for a cabaret license, and there was significant opposition from residents who went and petitioned, etc. So at the end, he was probably not going to get his license if he didn't sign the GNA. So he did sign the GNA. Fast forward 5 years, he ends up being non-compliant a lot around noise. And noise generated because the garage doors also don't go down. And we do have the provisions on the license, just noise, trash, garage doors, hours of operation, Monday through Friday, exceptions for New Year's Eve, things like that. So we have like 4 provisions on there. So, a resident moves in next door, new resident to the area, has issues with the noise. He starts complaining enough that a mediator got involved. So even without the R&O, the mediator, with enough complaints, the city will do something, okay, and it doesn't even matter if it was a GNA or not. However, this individual knew what the provisions were on the GNA and started saying the business is not following those provisions. So eventually a mediation occurs between the resident and the business, and additional provisions were put on the license. One of them including a crash bar to make sure that a door that is, constantly opening and closing, even while his garage doors are closed, is still leading to noise issues. So the city actually was able to do something like that. In the meantime, the business wanted to renegotiate one of the provisions. So we got into another year-and-a-half process with this business, and we polled the neighborhood, we did a survey. We eventually did change this because I believe actually it was somewhat restrictive, and the poll results from the 40 or 50 people who took it, it was a split. So he had a 9 p.m. close the garage doors and speakers. We moved that to 10 p.m., aligning with the noise ordinance. However, during this whole process, we ended up working with Steve Charbonneau as a mediator. But prior to that, I also worked with Dominic Viana and Erica Rogers, who both came to a meeting I set up with the residents kind of in the designated area to understand what's the recourse with a business that is consistently non-compliant with noise and there are complaints. And this is the type of presentation I was hoping that they could do, but it was really informative and it really gave power to the residents, to be honest. And here's what I learned about enforceability. One was, if it's on the face of the license, excise and license can enforce. In general, a GNA is a private contract between the R&O and the business. In terms of enforceability, and this was a big one, and this is what I wanted to really chime in about, was, well, we asked, what will happen with enough complaints, right? What they said is the license isn't going to be revoked immediately because of the complaints, on the provisions that are being broken. However, enough complaints and the director is going to get fed up, and then at the next renewal process, instead of it just being a rubber stamp renewal, they will create a hearing. And at that time, they would reconsider, all of what's going on to determine whether this business should have their license removed. So that was interesting. So, I think it's around renewal that enforcement can be done. And I think if you have a business who's constantly non-compliant and you're hearing this from the neighborhood, it's around renewal time that you could force their hand. However, force excise licenses hand to have a hearing. However, enough complaints because of non-compliance, Department of Health and Environment is going to get fed up, right? This is what I've heard. They're going to be the ones to say, you know what, we need a hearing. So that is what I learned about enforcement. And we ended up using the mediator another time to make sure, because we don't have an attorney on our side. We weren't going to hire an attorney and want to make sure everything was going to work. And back to Margie's point of something unusual is this was all wrapping up 2-3 months ago. And I sent the amendment to excise and license, and for about a month, no response, which was unusual because otherwise I've even texted some of these people. Unusual. I went and I was like, are these people dead or not working there anymore? What is going on? But I went through Steve Charbonneau, who was part of this amendment, a process to say, I didn't even receive acknowledgement that they received the amendment. And my question was, acknowledge it, let me know when it goes on, changes to the face of the license. Crickets for a month. Eventually, 1 month later, I asked Steve Charbonneau to find out. And, he forwarded me the email from Dominic that said, yes, this is what's going on. And just last week, I was on a hearing for a marijuana business to give them support, actually. First licensee under the social cannabis initiative, by the way, and Erica Rogers was on there. So I know these people are still there. They're not responding, and it's an issue. Margie, I agree with you 100%. This is unusual.
Very. Okay.
Thank you.
Let me go to Judy, and I think we have two more people who want to speak who've had years of experience with enforceability too. But Judy, go ahead, and then I'm going to go to Gertie. So
Yeah,
okay.
yeah, I'll be brief. And this enforceability thing really was insightful, and I really appreciate Travis's as well as Trupti's go to the source, figure it out, work it out, and work with. And I understand the licensing. Our situation is a little different because it's not one of those kinds of businesses that gets excise and license that we've had good neighbor agreements with. So it's been residential housing, and yes, they under some supervision, but the kinds of things we had good neighbor agreements about for an assisted living business in our neighborhood are not excise and license things. And our good neighbor agreement isn't attached to anything. And so that's where I agree. Start with collaboration, and working through your problems is always the first place to go. And it's sort of like, what are some other courses? And Trupti, your comment about, registering complaints, getting the city to pay attention is another way. If that doesn't work, another way of getting the attention to it. So my other question had been about registering good neighbor agreements so that they are officially somehow documented or recognized. And if anybody knows anything about that, because ours are not attached to any excise and license.
I just I put a note in, and with yours is an exception, just like it has no license. But what folks may not be aware of is breweries also do not go through the city liquor license process or excise and license at all. They get their liquor license directly from the state. Therefore, there is no mechanism. So breweries also fall into that same bucket like you're talking about. And I think there it becomes that contract between the the RNO and the entity. And I don't know that there would be any enforcement. But
so we can have Steve speak to that, because he's researched that in depth over the last few years. And so let's go to Gertie now, and then we can hold the questions for the end of the speakers. Thank you. And then, so Gertie is from West Wash Park. I can't even say it at the moment. And so Gertie has years of experience working with a lot of businesses on the Lincoln Broadway corridor and then some. So Gertie, why don't you go ahead and kind of give your perspective. And the other thing that I think has come up too is extra provisions or other kinds of agreements too.
Thanks, Loretta, and thank the rest of you for your input on this. I am particularly, I really appreciate Trupti giving her experience with excise and license and how what happens when repeatedly a business is violating the good neighbor agreement. I have been doing these for a number of years. I don't know how many I've done. And because our website crashed in December and the new website is coming up, is now up and running, I don't have examples of good neighbor agreements that I can share that are already on the web. For me, with my own personal experience is only with excise and license good neighbor agreements. And the thing that always struck me was that good neighbor agreements, as somebody mentioned earlier, are a contract between an RNO and a license applicant or a license holder. And a contract has to have consideration in order to be enforceable. And it always is interesting to me to hear people talk about good neighbor agreements, using it in the same, with the same meaning that where I question, is it a valid contract? Is it really enforceable in a court of law? And maybe that doesn't matter. Maybe the most important thing is establishing communication with the license applicant and the licensee, and setting up a mutually agreed upon expectations of behavior. I don't know how a good neighbor agreement is enforceable under the new group living amendments to the zoning code, because they don't have to have a public hearing. Neighbors do not have the power to stop the issue of the permit. And I don't know that it really bothered me when they were using that term, saying neighbors shouldn't be so concerned about these because you can execute a good neighbor agreement. It's not enforceable as a contract, but maybe if the business or license or permit holder is responsible enough, even though it's not legally enforceable in a court of law, it is, they will abide by the terms of the agreement. I've looked at these good opportunities to establish communication with the license applicants, because most of the licensees in our neighborhood are good people, and they are interested in being good neighbors, and they are a real asset to the neighborhood. We have liquor licenses and marijuana licenses in the middle of our neighborhood, in addition to those on the major thoroughfares of Alameda and Lincoln and Broadway. And so we have different standards for the ones that are surrounded by residential use in low density areas than we do for, say, along Lincoln and along Broadway, and but not, well, Broadway particularly. I've always looked at the purpose of a good neighbor agreement is to establish communication between the neighbors. And sometimes the neighbors are businesses. They are businesses that don't want a lot of loud noise coming through the wall from a cabaret at 8 o'clock at night when they're trying to sell retail goods to their businesses, to their customers. Then communicate the expectations of the neighbors and of the licensee and share that those expectations, and then establish how to resolve disputes and differences, and finally get conditions on the license. And I want to emphasize that from my perspective, it is really important for people who want to get into doing good neighbor agreements for their RNOs, read the policies and procedures. It always surprises me, things that have crept in, particularly in the October 2018 revisions, that we did not have a presentation at INCZAP, as far as I know, about those changes that were stuck in that version of the policies and procedures, but the definitions in there are important. One thing that really surprised me is that exhibits, including good neighbor agreements, are supposed to be filed 7 days before the hearing. I did not know that. And we've always gotten them in later. We've usually gotten them in later than that. But if you have a hearing officer who's a stickler for following the rules, you can get screwed if you think you've got a good neighbor agreement, but you don't get it filed 7 days in advance. Let's see. Somebody asked, what is the procedure for doing all this? When you get the notice packet from Excise and License that is sent out to both of, or to the contact people that are registered with Community Planning and Development for your RNO, look over the documents, look at the floor plan. Does it include a patio? Does it include a rooftop patio? Any outdoor seating? What is the designated area? We've had an example where instead of the designated area, which is the area 5 blocks north, south, east, and west of the location, they listed it for the area north of Broadway or on South Broadway, as opposed to North Broadway. So it was a totally different area. And that was able to be changed once we notified excise and license. Look at the application for the names and contact information and also the hearing date. Some of these hearing dates are coming up pretty darn quickly, and you need to set your timelines, particularly based on the 7-day filing requirement. But I realize they're not giving us the contact information in some instances. My experience is it's really helpful to Google the applicants because it gives you several things. It gives you some way of finding out whether or not they have other licenses somewhere else in the city. Is there another RNO that's got good neighbor agreements with them that you can contact to find out what kind of operator is this? And also, I mean, I've been able to get in contact with the applicant every single time without, even though the contact information has been redacted. I agree with Margie. I don't understand why they are now redacting that information because it is available, and it certainly would be easier if we didn't have to go do detective work to find it. On the other hand, doing that detective work can reveal information that is helpful because you get more information about the applicant. But I also think it's really helpful to visit the site. It is important to know whether or not there is room for future expansion. Is there room in the back or the front for special events, which would determine what you want to have on the license and what issues you want to address? And also, how close is it to residential? What is the zoning? What is the use now and what is the potential? Because even though it may be Main Street zoning, we've had MS zoning that has suddenly been developed into completely residential, and it's right across the alley from a liquor license. So those are things that, in my opinion, you need to keep in mind. Let's see. And you need to know the neighborhood and the neighbors. Do the neighbors care? Are there neighbors that are going to object to late night noise? Are they going to be bothered by it? Maybe not. Then when I contact an applicant, the first thing I do is welcome them into the neighborhood and say we are really excited to have new businesses and new licenses in the neighborhood, even though it may not be true sometimes, because there is a saturation of liquor licenses on Broadway that's driving out the retail, but never mind. We're not in a position at this point to object to that. And then ask them, before you bombard them with what you think they ought to do, ask them what's their business plan. Ask them, what are they going to do? What are they, what are their plans for hours? What are their plans for menu? What are their plans for outdoor entertainment, outdoor expansion, et cetera, because that way, when they will tell you things that they might not otherwise tell you. Yes, we don't plan on staying open past 10 o'clock. Well, yay. If you've got patios, then you can put that in the good neighbor agreement because they agreed to it. I mean, they've said that's what they wanted. And I found it helpful to compare to other establishments owned by the applicant. Sometimes they say, well, it was one company that said, we don't have any problem with neighbors on the 16th Street Mall. So we don't want a good neighbor agreement. Well, our neighborhood is different from the 16th Street Mall. And there are residences, there are old Victorians nearby, there are historic districts nearby. People live and plan to stay in this neighborhood, and it's different from the 16th Street Mall. And then Margie says, and I agree totally, when there's time, get a meeting set up with the applicant. And if you can, invite the neighbors, but you've got to have an applicant who's willing to meet with you. And the applicant, we had one guy who was an applicant living in Shanghai. Guess what? He was not going to meet with us. Not only that, we couldn't understand anything he said, but because he didn't speak English and I don't speak Mandarin. And then talk with them about good neighbor agreements that you've got with other businesses in the area, and why it's important to establish this kind of communication so that when problems develop, people don't go straight, or the RNO doesn't go straight to excise and license to complain. That because the good neighbor agreements, and this used to be an absolute requirement in good neighbor agreements, that there be the provision that you agree to mediate. However, there's also a provision in our good neighbor agreement that recognizes we can't stop individual neighbors. The RNO can't stop individual neighbors from complaining to excise and licenses. Okay, I look at these as insurance policies. And we've had a complete turnover of our West Wash Park board, and we've also had a turnover on the zoning committee. And from my perspective, it's important for, I don't know if to what extent we're going to continue to pursue good neighbor agreements with businesses. From my perspective, because I live on Lincoln, a half block away from a number of liquor licensed establishments with whom we have good neighbor agreements, and they've been very effective. And it is important to do this, but we have a form that we've used, and it may be changed, things may change in our neighborhood significantly. I just don't know. But because this is an insurance policy, in my opinion, it's prophylactic. It's a way of establishing this communication between the neighbors and the license holder that will benefit both sides on down the road. We have a form that we've used that was written by a lawyer who was on the Board of Adjustment for years, and is, in my opinion, it's a very good form. But the first part defines the parties and describes the parties, the location, the neighborhood, the license, and also the hearing date. I think it's important to have in that description of the licensed premises, not only a description of the actual area where they're going to serve liquor or marijuana or whatever, but a description of the zone lot, whether or not there is space in the front or the back or the side for special events. And also, if you can, indicate that it's right across the street from the alley from residential use. The reason I think that's important is because in the policies and procedures, the language that talks about good neighbor agreements and whether or not terms that initially are on the license will continue to be on the license if the license is transferred, it is not mandatory. That language is permissive. The director may or may not decide to continue those terms on the license. I think if in that initial paragraph, those initial paragraphs of the good neighbor agreement, where you're describing the premises, the more you can include about what's around there, the more information the director will have when he or she is considering whether or not in a transfer to include the language from that initially was agreed to be on the face of the license. Then the second part of our form are the terms that the applicant agrees to have on the license. Again, it is very clear in the policies and procedures that those terms have to be legal. They have to be enforceable. They have to be clear. You have to imagine a you're calling somebody to say they've got the patio open after the time when it's supposed to close. If the definition of when the patio is to close, it's not at sunset or it's, whatever. It's got to be a clear 10 o'clock, 9 o'clock, and it's got to be clear. It's not just close the patio. Are they to cease all service on the patio? And you run into tricky things when the main entrance and exit to the establishment is through the patio. You can't really close that down because otherwise people can't get in and out. But if the terms are not clear to a dumbbell who has never been there before and doesn't know anything about the history, it's going to be hard to keep it for the city attorney and excise and license to put it on the face of the license. In that second part of the GNAs, what we are doing is trying to protect primarily residential, but also some business neighbors from noise. And people have mentioned that, but when we say, and this is what's tough for me, Margie had an experience where there was an establishment on the first floor of a building that was all condominiumized. And the Denver code does not protect people on the third and fourth floor from noise coming out of an establishment on the first floor. And I don't know how you draft a term that says they agree not to have noise leading the premises exceed that allowed by Denver code. The Denver code says 55 decibels after a certain hour. However, the environmental health people, Margie's experience was they would not enforce it because the Denver code says measured at the point of residential zoning. And because it's a condominium building and it's mixed use, that's not residential zoning. And Margie can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think if we can put in that term to say wherever there is not exceed the limit prescribed in the Denver code at residential use, it may help protect a situation where there's noise going up to condominiums or across the street to Main Street, where there's Main Street zoning that has residential on the second and third floors. We've also limited alley patron access egress, except in case of emergencies, when it's coming, when the exit is, when the establishment is on an alley and there's residential use right across the alley. We've also limited special events to 7 days per year, no more than 2 or 3 events a year, because under the special events permit, they can do it every single weekend if they want, is my understanding. And we've also asked them to notify the RNO if they're applying to modify the premises or transfer the license 15 days before they apply for that. And then the third part of our form is standard language that where we agree to what's to be on the face of the license and travel with the license. There are a couple of other things that occurred to me and I can't remember exactly what they are at this point, but I'm interested in not only the good neighbor agreements, as Travis calls them, that China has executed with developers who are doing residential development, and it's not a license, it's not a public hearing for needs and desires of the neighborhood. Because I think that has real potential for those of us who have meetings with developers who say, well, I want to do this, but I want zoning that will allow me to do a whole lot more. And I think Baker has the experience of doing, I think you called it an MOU, a memorandum of understanding, with somebody who was getting commercial zoning, and they agreed not to exclude a number of the enumerated uses that would have been allowed under that new zoning. But not only that, they agreed to have it filed in the clerk and recorder's office so that it travels with the land. And that is, in my opinion, a very interesting concept that I'd like to hear more about from Steve Harley, Mr. Harley.
All right.
That's it.
Well, I'll introduce Steve Harley. Steve, well, if you don't know, he's my partner. But and so yeah, pointing to, he's in the other room, I'm in my office. So anyway, he is the chair of the BHNA zoning committee, and not that I participate in all zoning, but Steve is sometimes, unfortunately, for many, many years, our zoning chair, but he's been doing it for an awfully long time. He has experience and has knowledge of some things, and we'll go back and talk to the breweries and talk about that. But dovetail onto what Gertie was saying. Go ahead, Steve, take it over.
Sure. Hi, folks. First, I wanted to thank Margie and Gertie, especially because they both provided some guidance and example over the years, and really kind of helped BHNA, Baker Historic Neighborhood Association, be a good player in the Good Neighbor Agreement process. And also thanks to Trupti for bringing this forward to INC. We have a lot of good neighbor agreements, but the one that Gertie was referring to was a recent rezoning at 4th and Elati, a kind of unusual case where a party had bought the property, and it was a non-conforming industrial property in the middle of a URH 2.5 zone, and they could have developed it into row houses because it was big enough that they could have probably gotten 6 units onto it, but they wanted to do something fairly unusual, which was to keep the building, add onto the top of it, keep commercial use. Particularly, their intent was an art gallery on the bottom but then put a residence on the top, and it wouldn't have been an allowed use under the existing zoning. So they wanted to rezone, and they came to BHNA asking for our support, and through a process that was pretty amicable, we wound up with what Gertie described, a memorandum of understanding that basically took the list of allowed uses in the new proposed zoning and called out certain of those uses as not allowed uses, but didn't do it by custom zoning. Instead, they agreed to put I'm probably using the wrong term, but a covenant on the deed that would basically disallow those uses. And I don't have the documents at hand, but I could supply them later. In any case, the process was this: we signed a memorandum of understanding that promised that BHNA would, 1, support the rezoning, and 2, if the rezoning was successful, the applicant for the rezoning promised to put the covenant on the deed. And they then did get their rezoning and did put the covenant on the deed. We had to do a fair amount of outreach to neighbors. We asked the applicant to do a lot of the footwork there. There was a lot of back and forth. There was not total agreement among every neighbor, but I think we got a good agreement. And I think it was a small lot, and it was not nearly as intensive a potential use as some of the larger developments that people have dealt with. Particularly, I think Miles has probably dealt with, or Travis, sorry, has dealt with larger ones. But I think it's perhaps a good model of how to go forward. And I'd love to see some of the others that have been done along this line. The other place where we did a good neighbor agreement that didn't have a license involved was the Novel Strand Brewery, which is at First and Cherokee, is a brewery tap room. And what has already been mentioned is that these don't get a city liquor license process. So there's no chance to put that, any terms on the face of a license. What we had in that case was the participation of the landlord. And we did a three-way agreement with the landlord, the tenant being Novel Strand, and our R&O, and basically agreed to some terms and again agreed to a lot of the same things we would in a license-focused good neighbor agreement, but put them just in a good faith agreement, which is essentially what the contract is between an R&O and a liquor license. Is, as has been mentioned, it's not really hard to, I don't know of any cases where these have gone to court to resolve them. It really comes down to getting the terms out front so that you have a good relationship and an understanding. And I agree with a lot of what has been said already about that's the point. First and foremost is to create a relationship and some expectations. And we've been very lucky that most of our I don't think any of our good neighbor agreements have gone to mediation. Some of them have gone to notifications to the license holder and a little bit of renegotiation. And in a couple of cases, in collaboration with West Wash Park, have changed some terms, but the only places where we've had problems have been places that do not have good neighbor agreements, because a lot of our liquor licenses, especially along Broadway, Santa Fe, and Calumet, do not have good neighbor agreements, since the license preceded the whole process that we're talking about. Before the excise and license allowed good neighbor agreements to be entered in the hearing process as terms on the license, we did try to negotiate one with what's now Atomic Cowboy. I can't remember the name of the business that was there first, but Mona's, that's what it was. And we had an agreement in hand with them that was, again, just essentially good faith, although it was a contract. But in that case, we got to the hearing with a signed good neighbor agreement, and the attorney for the applicant at the start of the hearing decided that they couldn't, that they would renege their agreement. And so we got nowhere with that one. And that license has stood and been transferred several times, which is one of the main points of these agreements, is when an applicant comes to you with a proposal for a liquor licensed establishment, they'll come with some promises and, a business plan, maybe a menu, things like that. But we never expect that applicant to be definitely there for the foreseeable future. We always plan for whatever might happen with that license. Just like with a rezoning, your R&O should always look at all the possible uses of the land that the rezoning allows, not the promises of a particular developer who has a project in front of you. So we've seen an incredible amount of turnover of licenses along Broadway in particular, and when we do have a good neighbor agreement, it has helped us quite a lot with that, because it basically, excise and license has been good about carrying forward the terms. I know they're not required to carry them forward, but they have in almost all cases. So I have a couple other points, but I see Gertie raise her hand, so she might want to add something to what I said. You're on mute, Gertie.
I just wanted to add that it is important, and this is an experience that we had with the Good Neighbor Agreement that both Baker and West Wash Park had negotiated, because the letter authorizing the Baker representative to represent Baker was not presented at the hearing. The hearing officer refused to include on the terms of the license that Baker be informed. of modification or whatever. And it was just interesting. It's one of those things where depending on the hearing officer and the city attorney, you may get the rug pulled right out from underneath you if you have not followed the letter, not the spirit, but the letter of what's in those policies and procedures. Thanks, Steve.
Yeah, and that's a good segue to something else I was going to mention, which is every RNO is structured a little bit differently, but it's really important that your RNO be on board with the process, not just whomever is working on the Good Neighbor Agreement or whoever is excited about engaging with the businesses. It has to be, your RNO has to be solid. And in Baker's case, it's been a challenge at times, partly because we're membership oriented. We take every decision when possible to a meeting of the membership. And I know many other RNOs don't do this, but it means timing problems sometimes, and it creates a bifurcation because when the timing is too short, we have to go to the board of directors and get them to make a decision, often outside of a meeting, and you have to have procedures in your RNO for making those decisions quickly. But when possible, we go to the membership, and we have a standing policy to seek a good neighbor agreement with every liquor licensed establishment. And if one is not, if we can't agree on one, to oppose the license. And this is something we didn't have at first, and Gertie actually encouraged me to put that forward. It's really good to have a standing policy, because without it, you have to go through a process of making sure your RNO is on board with what you're proposing to do. You may know that it's the right thing and feel like that it's what should happen, but the RNO really has to sponsor the process. And then we have on occasion opposed licenses is one thing I wanted to mention, but it doesn't, in our cases, it has never succeeded in stopping a license. However, in at least one case, it has led the hearing officer to propose that the terms that we had asked for but not reached agreement on be added to the license despite the lack of a signed agreement. So it's worth doing a formal proposal to an applicant who, even if you don't think you're going to get an agreement, and to be sincere about it, and then to come to the hearing and put that proposed license into evidence, even if you didn't get an agreement. I don't know how often that happens, but it happened for us. And then I want to mention one other thing, which is consistency of terms. One thing we've been trying to do in our Good Neighbor Agreements is have, especially because a lot of them are along Broadway and Santa Fe and Calumet, where there's, we have a large number of liquor licensed establishments. At first, we would basically be pretty, I don't know, we just wanted to get an agreement, and we would, if the applicant said they wanted a little later time, I think we were probably a little too soft on that. And so we have a little bit of a hodgepodge in older agreements on specifically on the time of closing windows and outdoor patios, which is one of the main things that causes a disturbance to nearby residents. There's always going to be chatter and so forth, but we're first of all asking people not to have outdoor speakers and so forth. But then when a certain hour comes along, we ask that any garage doors or large windows, etc., are closed, and that the service to the outdoor patio stops. And we get into a little bit of trouble with a tough negotiations sometimes when the applicant says, well, I'm looking at your agreement and I see one that has hours later than the ones you're offering me. Because not all of them do this, but some of them do take the time to look through all the agreements that we've made. So I think if you're embarking on this process, just consider consistency of terms on the kinds of things that are most likely to be to get pushback. I think that's all the main things I wanted to cover. There's a lot to this. One thing I want to mention is we had a recent almost complete change in our board of directors, and so we're going to be coming back to the membership and the board and reaffirming our commitment to the good neighbor agreement process, because there's, as Gertie has alluded to, sometimes when new people come in, they say, why are we even bothering to do this? And so we need to do kind of a little bit of a sales pitch to get the buy-in. But one of the things that I'm working on is I've done an outline of our process, which starts with a notice from excise and license saying an application has been received, all the way through to the different kind of outcomes of what happens if we get an agreement or not, and so forth. I'm also going to do a simplified flow chart, because I think to get buy-in, you can't overwhelm them with all the details, although they are important. You have to give them a kind of an overview of the process that is approachable. And so I hope to finish that soon, and I'd be glad to share that with folks when I'm done. It may differ from the process you'd want to do in your R&O, but it's my approach is fairly technical on a lot of things, and so I'm trying to boil down technical processes is one of the ways that I try to get support from the rest of my neighbors. And if there are any questions, I'd be glad to take them on. I'm looking at the chat right now.
Let me just say a couple of things, and I think maybe a couple of people can respond. And I know, Gertie, you have your hand up. One of the things that I think we've had on Broadway is we've had neighbors with good neighbor agreements that we've had people actually work with the owner. I'm thinking of Illegal Pete's, for issues that have arisen. So maybe you want to address that just quickly, Steve, and then Gertie, we go to you.
Say again, please. Say again, please. I didn't catch the question.
Did you hear me about, if we had people who had issues with a specific business, like Illegal Pete's or somewhere, and then what did they do and how did they work through that process?
Sure. Well, Gertie and I think both dealt with Illegal Pete's when there was a complaint, and we worked with Pete, and he was fairly responsive, and we basically, he said he needed to train his manager better, and I think the outcome has been mostly positive. It's kind of an ongoing thing because it's a rowdy business, but they did agree, among other things, to close a gate onto an alley, which was across the alley from residences. And that was a major cause of complaints. And I think they were responsive to that. So it was basically through the process in the Good Neighbor Agreement, giving notice, essentially that threatens to require mediation, but we never got to mediation because we worked it out. And I see in the chat talking about marijuana dispensary businesses. First I want to mention that BHNA has never initiated a Good Neighbor Agreement with them because honestly, at least in our area, they are not nearly the kind of concern that liquor licenses are. People don't stumble out of dispensaries shouting at their friends and not able to find where they park their car and vomiting into the tree lawns. They're there's in some cases I suppose there might be some parking issues, with grows I know there are odor issues, but none of the grows in Baker, of which we have several, are really that close to residences. So, but we did do at the request of the applicant, we did do an agreement with one dispensary, and it was fairly similar in process. There's some slight differences, but you know, security is maybe one of the big concerns with them, because you know they want security too. So it wasn't really a bone of contention, but that was something that I recall was put into our agreement. I'll let others chime in if they can.
Gertie, go ahead.
Thank you. I want to emphasize something that Steve said about getting, even if the good neighbor agreement is not signed, getting it admitted into evidence, because again, the policies and procedures say that the director may include conditions on the license at his or her discretion. This is discretionary. And if you get the evidence in there that this is a term, the one I'm thinking of particularly was, and we screwed up and didn't get the GNA into evidence, but the issue was whether or not they were going to close their patio, and they announced numbers of the orders onto the patio over a loudspeaker. And it was clearly audible across the street. And I think if we had gotten the good neighbor agreement in there and said that the representative from Baker had heard it clearly from across the street, it's not speculative that that's what's going to happen. She has heard it. It is not speculation about what might happen in the future. And so I think we could have asked the hearing officer to include at least the limitation that sound coming from the premises not exceed that allowed by Denver code, but we screwed up and didn't do that. As to the marijuana license, we have a grow right in the middle of residential zoning. And when they applied for their, they had the dispensary license and the grow license. And then once they legalized retail or recreational marijuana, that was our opportunity to go in and get a good neighbor agreement. And we have in that agreement that they install filters and that they not allow odor to escape into the beyond the premises. You can't say into the neighborhood because that's not clearly enough defined. And so I have talked to two neighbors down there and told them when you can smell it and you're a block north of the establishment, not downwind, but upwind, you can call them and tell them it's time to change the filter. And if that doesn't work, then you've got to go to excise and go to environmental health for odor control. But the owner of the establishment is so inured to the smell of marijuana, he doesn't even notice it. It's like somebody who's worked around horses all their life. Manure doesn't, it's not a bad smell. It's part of life. And I think this guy, really, he's a nice young man. I just hate to think what else he's missing in life with losing his sense of smell. But never mind. That worked.
A quick comment about something that Gertie said in passing, which is, I think, important. As I mentioned, we have a lot of liquor licenses on Broadway that precede the institution of good neighbor agreements. One thing that happens sometimes is a change that gives you a foot in the door. And Gertie mentioned that this marijuana establishment went for a retail license, and that gave them the opportunity when they didn't already have an agreement. Well, a lot of times what happens with especially, we're seeing it a lot on Broadway, is an established liquor license asks for a cabaret license. And we've used that opportunity more than once as a way to step in and add a good neighbor agreement to our relationship with a business that has been in operation, probably with its license being transferred multiple times over the years, but a license that has existed for a long time can then you can use that as your launching point for basically bringing them into the fold of all the other businesses that you've got good neighbor agreements with.
Trupti, did you have a comment, a question?
Yeah, oh, you know what, I was going to reiterate what Steve indicated, and I think we're going down this route, which is to have a policy, have a process for your RNO, have a policy, and have this documentation because of turnover, and maybe, you know, your RNO is transitioning or your neighbor is transitioning and you're getting stuff that wasn't there before. We're kind of in that. So our goal was going to be to actually Steve shared his process, and we're going to kind of go that same route. And our goal is going to be to have a template and a process adopted via community outreach and input. And this way we can then act on behalf of the community without actually taking each license to the community to say, we're going to work on the GNA. Do you want to be a part of the process? And kind of go over the typical provisions and things like that. So if you're an RNO that doesn't have it, or you think you want to begin doing this, you might want to go on that path so that, you know, you have an adopted policy and template. I think that will give us more integrity, and to do it, you know, not just 10 people who are on the board type of thing. So thank you, Steve, for sharing a lot of the stuff that you shared with us.
Gertie, did you?
Yeah, I just, one of the things that concerns me with the sort of policy that goes on is that, as I remember, not only in the Board of Adjustment things that they say you have to do in order to present your position, I think it's also in somewhere else. No, it's in the RNO ordinance, that you have to describe what kind of outreach did you do to the community. And there was one hearing where the hearing officer or the city attorney, it was the city attorney, wanted to know what kind of outreach had we done to the immediate neighbors who were going to be impacted by this new license. And fortunately, we had this detailed little flyer that compulsive Gertie Grant had drafted and distributed up and down Lincoln that I could show them. But I don't, you know, so much depends on the individual city attorney and the hearing officer about what you need to do in order to establish that you've done the outreach, or that the outreach is even a question, is to me an issue when you have a policy that maybe is reaffirmed annually or whatever, but it is a question of that can create problems.
Thanks, Gertie.
Okay. One thing I would like to alert everybody to is we did have a committee on the new proposed RNO ordinance. And I think Maggie should have a copy of the one sheet that will be hopefully required before you go to hearing. And that included how many individuals in your neighborhood, and the outreach. Was it in a newsletter? Was it a meeting? It is an excellent one sheet requirement, and that will prevent a lot of the issues that we've had in the past. For example, from one person hearing at one person attending a hearing and saying, I have the agreement of the residents and they have not reached out to them. This form will absolutely prohibit that. And Paul Cashman, I am hoping, will recommend that form to be adopted. It's excellent, and I do believe that Maggie should have that. I know you have it, Loretta.
Yeah, and I appreciate that input because I think, one of the things about INC is we want participation from RNOs, right? We want RNOs to be engaged. We want RNOs to feel empowered. And some RNOs and some neighborhoods don't have RNOs, which we would hope would, and we would hope everybody would be engaged. And because there's diverse interest across the city. And, as you've heard today, some neighborhoods have a lot of businesses, have a lot of good neighbor agreements, some don't. But I think this has been valuable information for all of us to hear from everyone about. And now you have some faces and some names, and reach out to them in the chat if you want to get their email information. And I did want to bring in Jean Granville. Do you want to speak a minute? Because she's in Sun Valley, and if you want to talk about West Side and kind of a little bit about that, if you want to chime in.
Well, I'll say something, but I'll tell you, I really bow to everyone here for all the work that you've done over the years. Some of this, I think we've intuited naturally a little bit, and others we've kind of learned the hard way in the few GNAs that we've undertaken. But we are, and we've done some of the things like establishing, we set a policy, having been led to the altar by an applicant, and then really at the hearing refused to have it attached or transferable. And so we've learned, kind of the hard way, I think, how to do some things. But I really agree that there is a lot of, just in the few that I've been to and participated in, we've just, and then as we are talking among some of our West Side neighborhoods that are not part of INC, and I'm hoping to kind of bridge some of those areas that are of mutual interest. I know that we don't always agree on some of the some of the policies perhaps that get adopted, but certainly in terms of just the really, just really hardcore information and experience that INC members have. It's just, worth its weight in gold. So I really appreciate it.
Thank you. And I just want to chime in if Travis or Margie, anybody, Travis, I know you have to leave. Do you have anything you want to add after hearing everyone else?
Well, first, I just wanted to say thank you for hosting the conversation. I think it's really important, but also I think it's always a good reminder for us to look to one another for guidance and support as we're having these conversations and learning from, I refrain from saying best practice, but one another's art and science of crafting these good neighbor agreements. So I'm happy to be available if anybody wants to sit down and talk more about the mechanics or a particular circumstance where we could be of value. And that's to neighborhoods within Chun's boundaries and those outside of.
And I say, look at Chun. Steve's put a link in there. I think we all have, look at the chat and find those links, but Chun has some examples of good neighbor agreements. And I think I would love to follow what's happening at that old Channel 7 building, because I think that's an interesting process. And I think we all have some things to share with each other. Anybody else?
When I started out on this many, many years ago, I thought, oh, how hard can this be? Little did I know. But the very first thing I did is I did not know what occurred at a hearing. And it's a shame that we have COVID now, because I was able to go, I watched for a contested hearing and I sat there and saw what was going on, and it really helped me represent the neighborhood thereafter. And if, I don't know which committee, or if you want to do it, Loretta, as just INC, but these kind of get-togethers and sharing of information is exactly what everyone needs to represent their neighborhood. And they really are win-win procedures. So Loretta, heads up, you did a great job. I appreciate it very much, having all this information that we've all shared with each other. Thank you.
Well, I really appreciate it. And I think what our next steps are, I'll work with you, Margie, and maybe we can have, Gertie, I think you have the experience. I don't know who else wants to join us, but we'll have a small group and maybe we can reach out to Excise and License and see what's going on, see if we can figure out what's happening. And I think the issue is, I think you've heard from everybody today. I think Googling, like Gertie said, you get that extra information. You see what other sites in the city or other cities maybe that this, business or developer has. I know in the past we had an establishment on Broadway that they had a different liquor establishment in another community in Adams County. So we could look and see what they had there. And they even told us. But I think, again, inviting businesses to your RNO to present, they have come ahead of time. Like Gertie said, you want that, the layout of the establishment, right? And sometimes they come with the plans and they show us, we're going to have a window that's going to be open to the street, so, a garage door window. So, they might come and tell us what they think their hours of their establishment is. We have a cookie business or Voodoo Donuts that are open 24/7. It's kind of those establishments and what do you have and what's in your neighborhood. So anybody else have anything else they want to add? Steve, Gertie, Margie, anybody? I think this has been a wonderful presentation, a wonderful discussion. I think this is ongoing. Clearly, we all want to keep communicating about this. Maggie?
Well, one thing I would like to point out is when you do have a liquor license application, the city will send you a map of the various areas surrounding the applicant, and it's a 5-block radius on either side. Bear in mind sometimes that may include overlapping RNOs. So it's very, very important that the other RNOs agree and help to support the home, what I call the home RNO, the one where the address actually is in, rather than stepping across the line and saying, I just think it's fine. I think it's great. It has caused for some serious, serious problems in terms of applications and whether the RNO actually has any kind of validity.
Well, thanks for that. The other thing to keep in mind that I want to bring up is, and I had a discussion previously with Erica Rogers about this because of the common consumption area, right? This has been approved by state statute, and it's more prevalent in Glendale, but Denver's starting to work on common consumption areas. Now, if you remember this is where there are businesses next to each other that could be liquor establishments right next to each other, but it could be a retail business and they decide to open, and you could have a common consumption area where you could have liquor. You might have a pink glass and you might have, well, I guess you can't see it in my background, or a brown glass, and you could walk from that establishment to a common area and walk to another one, but they would know by your pink glass that you came from the Pink Flamingo, or, you know, or the Brown Barrel has the brown cups or whatever. You know, we can't have this on Broadway, and I don't think it could happen on Colfax unless there was a way that it could go behind the business, because it cannot block a sidewalk. So they wouldn't be able to block the sidewalk area. But, you know, this is for larger areas. Think of Stanley Marketplace or something like that, where you could have a cocktail or a craft beer and you could walk from one place to another. Now, they talked about, excise and license talked about good neighbor agreements, and you might have an individual good neighbor agreement with one individual license holder, but this is a new over umbrella, you know, entity that you could also have a good neighbor agreement with that entity. So, you know, that's something to keep in mind if there is a common consumption area in your RNO, but that's something just to keep in mind that I wanted to bring up also. So I don't know if anybody has anything else to add on this discussion, but we will have this on the INC website, look in about a week or so. But I don't know if there's any other new business anybody wants to bring up or anything else. Go ahead and raise your hand or chime in. I don't think we had anybody by phone today. I don't see that. As again, when I started the meeting today, I hope one day we'll go back to in person, but for now, this gives us the capability of recording. People can watch it at a later time, which I think is valuable. You can come back and get resources and that information. Again, hopefully you've exchanged information via the chat if you wanted contact information. If not, hopefully we can get it to you later. But I don't know if we have anything else. Do I have a motion to adjourn today? No.
Make a motion to adjourn.
Who is that? Was that
Emmett.
Emmett? Okay. Do we have a second?
I'll second, Judy.
Okay, that's Judy. All right. I'm gonna go ahead.
Loretta,
Yes.
I don't read the chat. This is Gertie. I don't read the chat as this is going on because I find it distracting. If anybody wants to contact me, my email is gertiegrant@estreet.net. I'm sorry, I can't focus on, I can't listen and also read and respond to the chat. So and there've been a couple of things I think that people have asked me to share stuff, and they just need to contact me.
Yeah, and you said your website's not up right now.
No, the website is up, but we don't have our good neighbor agreements on it because I haven't had a chance to get them all together and put it on the new website.
Okay, all right.
Okay.
Maggie?
Thanks, everybody. Sorry.
We will publish the chat.
Okay.
So that information will be there. When we put up the video, we'll also put up the chat.
Okay, perfect. All right, great. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and end the meeting then. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the discussion. All right, take care, everyone. Have a nice day. Stay